Berlin, April 1945. The sky over the capital was not blue. It was not gray. It was the color of bruising, a sickly purple mixture of smoke, pulverized brick, and the dying light of an empire. Listen closely. Beneath the roar of the Soviet artillery, beneath the screams of the sirens, there was another sound, a mechanical purr, deep, rhythmic, powerful. It was the sound of the Daimler-Benz straight-eight engine. While the Third Reich was collapsing into rubble, a secret operation was taking place in the shadows. The order had come from the highest levels of the Ministry of Armaments. It was stamped with the red wax seal of highest priority. The mission? To save the soul of German engineering. They called it Operation Iron Vault. 9 vehicles lined up at the factory gates. These were not military trucks. They were not tanks. They were the Grosser Mercedes, the 770K, and the legendary 540K Special Roadsters. Look at them. Even covered in the dust of war, they looked like creatures from another world. The chrome radiator grills stood like fortress walls. The hand-stitched leather seats smelled of wealth and power. But on this night, they were refugees. The drivers were terrified, not of the enemy soldiers, but of the cargo they carried. One scratch on the aluminum bodywork, one cracked headlight, and they could be court-martialed for sabotaging national treasures. They moved out under the cover of darkness. No headlights, no radio communication, just hand signals and the terrifying instinct of survival. We have recovered the original route maps from the archives. They didn't take the Autobahn. The Autobahn was a shooting gallery for Allied fighter planes. Instead, they took the back roads, through the dense black forest, over the winding mountain passes of Thuringia. Imagine driving a 5-ton limousine on a mud track in pitch darkness while the horizon glows orange from burning cities. Finally, they reached their destination, Merkers. To the untrained eye, it was just a small, insignificant village. But beneath the ground lay a labyrinth, the Kaiserroda salt mine, 2,000 feet deep. The mine was chosen for a specific reason. Salt, potassium chloride. It absorbs moisture. It creates a sterile, dry environment, a natural humidor for steel and leather. The engineers knew that if they left these cars on the surface, the humidity and the rust would eat them alive within a decade. But down here, in the salt, they would last for 1,000 years. The elevator ride down was a nightmare. The cage was designed for miners, not for massive luxury cars. They had to grease the sides of the fenders just to squeeze them in. Down, down, down into the abyss. The silence at the bottom was absolute. They pushed the cars by hand through the white tunnels. The salt crystals on the walls glittered like diamonds in the flashlight beams. It was a funeral procession for machines. They parked them in room number 8, a vast cavern carved out of the rock. They draped them in canvas. They disconnected the batteries. They locked the doors. And then they left them alone in the dark. Time stopped. For days, the cars sat in the absolute darkness of room number 8. Above them, the war was raging. Cities were burning. The German army was retreating. But down here, there was only the sound of the earth settling. April 4th, 1945. The silence was broken, not by the hum of a German engine, but by the roar of an American Sherman tank. The 91st Infantry Division of the U.S. Third Army rolled into the small village of Merkers. They were tired. They were covered in mud. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for a place to sleep. But then, a rumor started to spread. 2 local women were overheard talking near a bakery. They whispered about a gold room. They whispered about a treasure so vast it could buy the entire world. The intelligence officers were skeptical. Nazi gold was usually a myth. But they decided to investigate the mine entrance anyway. They rounded up the German mine administrators. They forced them to operate the elevators. Imagine the scene. A group of young American GIs, boys from farms in Ohio and factories in Detroit, stepping into a dark cage with their rifles raised. The descent took forever. The air grew hotter. The pressure built in their ears. When the cage doors opened at the bottom, they weren't prepared for what they saw. The main vault. It was like stepping into the cave of Ali Baba. There were bags of gold Reichsmarks piled to the ceiling. There were suitcases filled with diamonds. There were boxes containing the crown jewels of ancient kings. But then, Private First Class Clyde Harmon turned his flashlight to the left. "Hey, Sarge, you better look at this." The beam of light cut through the gloom and hit the polished fender of a Mercedes-Benz 770K. It was sitting there, majestic, imposing, surrounded by sacks of gold. Yet somehow, it looked more valuable than all of it. The soldiers approached it cautiously. They had seen cars before, but they had never seen a machine like this. It was 20 feet long. It was armored. It was a rolling fortress built for a dictator. One soldier reached out and touched the door handle. It opened with a solid, mechanical thunk. He shined his light inside. The interior was pristine. The wood was polished walnut. The seats were unmarked. It was a ghost car, waiting for a driver who would never return. April 8th, 1945. The news had reached the top. General George S. Patton, old blood and guts himself, arrived at the mine. He didn't come alone. He brought General Eisenhower and General Bradley. The 3 most powerful men in the Allied Army were standing 2,000 feet underground. Patton walked up to the Mercedes. He kicked the tires. He looked at the massive engine. He reportedly said, "These Krauts really knew how to build a machine." But Patton saw something else. He didn't just see a car. He saw technology. He saw the independent suspension. He saw the supercharger. He saw the future of warfare and engineering. He turned to his aides and gave an order. "Get them out. Get them all out. We are sending them to America." But there was a problem: the manifests. The paperwork found in the mine office listed 9 cars of special importance. Patton's men counted the cars in the vault. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where were the other 4? The generals looked at the mine administrators. The administrators looked at the floor. They realized then that the treasure hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. Somewhere out there, in the chaos of the collapsing Reich, 4 of the most dangerous, beautiful, and valuable cars ever built were still on the run. The extraction order was given at dawn. General Patton wanted the cars out, but getting them in was hard. Getting them out was a mathematical nightmare. The elevators were the bottleneck. The engineers calculated the clearance. There was less than 2 inches of space on either side of the 770K's rear fenders. It became a delicate operation of brute force and surgical precision. American GIs and captured German mechanics, men who were shooting at each other a week ago, were now working shoulder to shoulder. They wrapped the bumpers in thick wool blankets. They greased the elevator shaft walls with industrial lubricant. Slowly, inch by inch, the steel cables groaned under the weight. The elevator cage swayed in the darkness. If a cable snapped now, history would fall 2,000 feet and be flattened into scrap metal. Then, the moment of truth. The elevator reached the surface level. The iron gates opened. For the first time in weeks, the iron jewels felt the sun. The light was blinding. Soldiers cheered, cameras clicked. You have seen the photos in history books. Young American soldiers sitting on the hood of Hitler's limousine, smoking Lucky Strikes, laughing. It was the ultimate symbol of victory. The monster's chariot had been captured. But while the champagne was popping in Merkers, a dark realization was settling in the intelligence tent. The manifest. The numbers didn't add up. Intelligence officers interrogated the transport director. They shone a bright light in his eyes. They asked him one question over and over again. Where are the others? Slowly, the story leaked out. There was a second convoy. On the night of the departure from Berlin, 4 cars had split off from the main group. They didn't go to the mine. They went south, toward the Alpine Redoubt, toward the mountains where the Nazi leadership planned their final suicidal stand. These 4 cars were the experimental prototypes, the ones with the secrets. Intelligence reports spotted them moving at night through the Bavarian forest, a phantom column of aluminum and shadow. They were heading for a dead end, a place where the roads stopped and the cliffs began. Austria. The Americans loaded the Merkers cars onto trucks bound for the coast. They were safe. But for the ghost convoy, the journey was just entering its darkest chapter. They weren't heading for a vault of salt. They were heading for a grave of water. Lake Toplitz is waiting, and it does not give up its dead easily. While the main convoy descended into the safety of the Merkers salt mine, history was splitting into 2 paths. While the Americans were celebrating their discovery in the north, a second, darker chapter was being written in the south. We call it The Ghost Convoy. The shipping manifests, recovered decades later from a burned-out office in Stuttgart, tell us the terrifying truth. 9 cars left the factory, 5 went to the mine, but 4, they simply vanished into the mist. These were not standard cars. According to the diaries of the chief test driver, Rudolf Uhlenhaut, these were the experimental high-speed variants, the streamliners, the Autobahn Couriers. They were designed for a world of infinite speed, but now they were trapped in a world of mud and ruin. Imagine the scene on the night of the split. We are on the winding, treacherous roads of the Bavarian Alps. The altitude is high, the air is thin. The temperature is dropping below freezing. The engines of these 4 cars, massive 8-cylinder beasts, were struggling. They were running rich, gasping for oxygen in the thin mountain air. Leading the pack was the Gray Ghost, a one-of-a-kind 540K streamliner. Its body was made of hand-hammered aluminum. It was designed to slice through the wind at 180 kilometers per hour. It was crawling at walking speed. The drivers were exhausted. They had been driving for 3 nights straight. They moved only in absolute darkness. During the day, they had to hide the cars in dense pine forests. They covered the shimmering aluminum bodies with heavy branches and camouflage nets. They had to hide the reflection of the chrome from the prowling Allied fighter planes patrolling the skies above. Every kilometer was a battle for survival. Fuel was the new gold. The petrol stations had been bombed into rubble. The convoy had to stop at remote farmhouses. The drivers traded their watches, their leather coats, sometimes even the spare tires, just to get a few liters of low-grade tractor fuel. The engines knocked and sputtered on the bad gasoline, but they kept moving, south, always south. They were heading for the Alpine Redoubt, the mythical fortress where the Nazi leadership planned to make their final stand. But as they crossed the border into Austria, the reality set in. There was no fortress. There was no safety. There was only a dead end. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, and finally to mud. The suspension systems of the cars, complex designs meant for the racetrack, were being punished by the rocks and the ruts. Finally, deep in the Salzkammergut region, the road simply ended. They found themselves at the edge of a body of water that looked like ink. Lake Toplitz. It is a place of breathtaking beauty and terrifying silence. Surrounded by vertical limestone cliffs that plunge straight into the water, it is a geographical trap. There is no way out but the way you came. And the way they came was now blocked by the advancing American army. The convoy stopped at the water's edge. The drivers cut the engines. The silence of the lake was heavy. The officers in charge held a meeting on the shore. They looked at the map. They looked at the cliffs. And then they looked at the cars. They realized that the mobile preservation mission had failed. They could not go forward. They could not go back. So, they made a decision that would create the greatest underwater mystery of the 20th century. They decided to execute the cars. They didn't want the technology to fall into enemy hands. They didn't want the Soviets or the Americans to study the superchargers or the aerodynamics. So they lined them up on the wooden pier. One by one, they released the parking brakes. They put the transmissions into neutral. It was a slow, painful process. Men pushed against the beautiful, curved fenders. The tires rolled over the wooden planks. First, the tires touched the water, then the bumpers, and then, with a splash that echoed off the canyon walls, the first car tipped forward. It floated for a moment, the air trapped in the trunk keeping it buoyant. The headlights pointed up at the stars. And then, with a gurgle of escaping air, it slipped beneath the surface. Down into the cold, down into the darkness. Lake Toplitz is over 100 meters deep, and below 20 meters, the water contains no oxygen. It is anoxic. The cars did not rot, they did not rust. They simply drifted down to the bottom and landed in the soft silt, waiting for a diver who wouldn't be born for another 20 years. The year is 1945, but the story of Lake Toplitz does not end with the sinking. It only begins. For months, the lake sat silent. The black water concealed its new prisoners perfectly. To the local villagers, nothing had changed. The mountains were the same. The forest was the same. But beneath the surface, a fortune in engineering was suspended in the cold, dark mud. Then came the Americans. The U.S. Navy diving teams, fresh from the salvage operations of the Pacific, arrived with heavy equipment. They were not looking for cars. They were looking for the rumored Nazi gold and the experimental weapon files that intelligence reports said had been dumped in the lake. Picture the scene on the wooden docks. It was a gray, misty morning. The divers were suiting up in heavy canvas suits and massive copper Mark V hard hat helmets. These were not modern scuba divers. They were tethered to the surface by thick rubber air hoses and communication cables. The descent into Toplitz is terrifying. As the lead diver sank past the 10-meter mark, the light from the surface began to fade. By 20 meters, it was total darkness. The water temperature dropped to near freezing. At 30 meters, the diver reported something strange over the crackling radio. The bottom of the lake was not rock. It was a thick, soft silt, almost like quicksand. And sticking out of this silt were shapes that did not belong in nature. He moved his heavy lead boots through the mud, fighting the pressure. He shined his underwater torch into the gloom. The beam of light cut through the suspended particles and hit a wall of chrome. It was the radiator grille of a Mercedes-Benz. But it wasn't just lying on its side like a shipwreck. Due to the heavy engine block in the front and the air trapped in the trunk, the car had landed perfectly upright. It was sitting on the bottom of the lake, headlights staring into the darkness, as if it were still waiting for a traffic light to change. The diver described it as a ghost. The lack of oxygen at that depth meant there was no rust. The chrome was as bright as the day it left the factory. The three-pointed star on the hood acted like a mirror, reflecting the diver's light back at him. The operation to raise the ghost convoy was a feat of brute force engineering. They couldn't just pull them up. The suction of the mud held the cars with a grip of tons. If they pulled too hard, they would rip the chassis in half. They had to use high-pressure water jets to blast the silt away from the wheels. It took hours of dangerous work in absolute darkness. The divers had to feel their way around the fenders, attaching steel cables to the frame rails, careful not to damage the aluminum bodywork. Then, the signal was given to the surface. Hoist away! On the shore, a massive diesel winch began to turn. The steel cables pulled tight, singing with tension. The water at the surface began to churn and bubble. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the shape began to rise. First came the roof, black and sleek, breaking the surface tension. Then the windshield, still intact. And finally, the massive front grille, dripping with lake water and mud. As the car swung in the air above the lake, the engineers on the shore were silent. They weren't looking at a piece of scrap metal. They were looking at a time traveler. They opened the doors. Water poured out from the interior, gallons of it. But when they wiped the mud from the dashboard, they saw the truth. The wood was swollen but intact. The leather seats were soaped but not rotted. Inside the glove compartment, they found the original maps the drivers had used, the ink still legible after months underwater. But there was something missing. The manifests said there were 4 cars dumped in this sector. The divers found 3. They swept the bottom with sonar. They dragged grappling hooks. They dove until they hit the limit of their endurance. But the 4th car, the legendary Black Pearl, the prototype with the modified supercharger, was gone. It wasn't in the mud. It wasn't on the shore. It was as if the lake had swallowed it whole. Or perhaps someone else had gotten there first. The search for the 4th car continued for weeks. The divers mapped every inch of the lake bed. They found crates of counterfeit British currency. They found rusty weapons. They even found the skeleton of a horse. But the Black Pearl, the supercharged prototype, had vanished into thin air. Rumors began to circulate among the locals. Some whispered that the car was never dumped. They claimed that under the cover of the chaotic final night, a high-ranking SS officer had driven it away, through the secret mountain passes into Italy, and perhaps onto a ship bound for South America. It remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the war. A ghost car, driving on a ghost road, somewhere in the pages of history. But for the 3 cars that were recovered, the journey was far from over. They were dragged up the muddy banks of the lake. They were dripping with slime and algae. But beneath the filth, the engineering was still alive. The American mechanics worked feverishly. They drained the water from the crankcases. They filled the cylinders with oil. They knew that once the oxygen hit the wet metal, corrosion would strike like a disease. They crated them up, huge wooden boxes made of rough-hewn pine. Stenciled on the side in black paint were the words, "War Trophy, property of U.S. government." They were loaded onto heavy transport trucks and driven north, past the bombed-out ruins of Munich,
passed the remains of the factories that built them. Finally, they reached the port of Bremerhaven. Waiting for them was a Liberty ship, a gray steel giant destined for the Atlantic.
The cranes lifted the crates. They swung in the air, suspended between the old world and the new. The German soil fell from their tires for the last time. Crossing took 14 days. While the cars sat in the dark hold of the ship, the world above was changing. The war was over. The atomic age had begun. These cars were no longer just vehicles. They were relics, dinosaurs of a lost era of craftsmanship. Then, the skyline appeared. New York City, 1946. The Statue of Liberty stood watch as the ship glided into the harbor. It was a stark contrast. The cars of the Third Reich arriving in the land of the free. They were unloaded onto the docks of Brooklyn. The crates were pried open. Dock workers stopped their work to stare. Even covered in travel dust, the cars commanded respect. The sheer size, the arrogance of the design. It was unlike anything Detroit had ever produced. But they were not going to a museum, not yet. The Army had plans for them. They wanted to know the secrets of the German engines. They wanted to tear them apart. And after that, they would be sold to the highest bidder. The iron jewels had survived the firebombing. They had survived the salt mine. They had survived the bottom of the lake. Now, they had to survive something even more dangerous. The American auction block. Maryland, 1946. The war was over, but for the iron jewels, the interrogation was just beginning. They were not treated as guests. They were treated as prisoners of war. The U.S. Army transported the cars to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, a cold industrial military facility designed for testing tanks and artillery. The engineers at Aberdeen didn't care about the luxury. They didn't care about the hand-polished walnut dashboards or the leather seats stitched by artisans in Stuttgart. To them, these cars were just machines, rival technology. They opened the hoods. They stripped down the engines. They wanted to know how the Germans achieved such power. They studied the superchargers, the independent suspension, the metallurgy of the chassis. It was a brutal process. Parts were removed and never replaced. Original bolts were swapped for American hardware. The paint was scratched by careless mechanics who saw these cars as Nazi junk. Reports from the time show a lack of respect. One engineer described the 540K as over-engineered and unnecessarily complex. They compared it to the simple, mass-produced Fords and Chevrolets, and they laughed at the German obsession with perfection. Once the military was done with them, the cars had no purpose. They sat in an open field at the proving ground, exposed to the rain and the snow. The chrome began to pit. The leather began to crack. The once proud symbols of an empire were now just used cars. Then came 1948. The War Assets Administration made a decision. They needed to clear the inventory. They announced a public auction. Imagine this. A cold November morning, a government warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia. Lined up on the concrete floor were the cars that had once carried kings and dictators. The cars that had been hidden in salt mines and sunk in lakes. And the starting bid? $50. The buyers were not museums. They were not wealthy collectors. They were carnival owners who wanted a monster car to attract crowds. They were taxi drivers looking for a cheap limousine. They were eccentrics who just wanted a piece of the war. One of the 770,000 limousines, a car worth $20 million today, was sold to a tobacco farmer from North Carolina for $300. He planned to use the engine to power his water pump. Another, a rare roadster, was bought by a returning soldier who drove it home, parked it in his barn, and covered it with hay. He never drove it again. And just like that, they vanished again. Not into a mine, not into a lake, but into the vast, anonymous landscape of America. Into dusty garages in Ohio, into damp basements in Chicago, into the tall grass of fields in Texas. They became rumors, urban legends told by car hunters in diners. "I saw a Mercedes in a barn," they would say. "It had armor plating. It had a supercharger." But nobody believed them. Until now. Decades passed. The world moved on. The 1950s turned into the 60s. The 60s turned into the 70s. The iron jewels of the Third Reich were all but forgotten. They were ghosts of a war that nobody wanted to remember. But in the underground world of car collectors, the whispers never stopped. They told stories of the sleeping beauties. There was a rumor of a 540K Special Roadster, one of the rarest cars on Earth, hidden in a mechanic's shop in Connecticut. The owner was a recluse. He kept a shotgun behind the door. He refused to let anyone see the car. For 30 years, people said it was a myth. But then, in 1976, the old man died. Collectors flew in like vultures. They pried open the rusted garage doors. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of old oil. They moved aside piles of old newspapers, broken lawnmowers, and boxes of junk. And there it was, buried under a mountain of trash, covered in raccoon droppings, sat a shape that made their hearts stop. They wiped away the grime from the fender. The black paint was still there. The chrome was pitted but solid. It was chassis number 154076, one of the cars from the Ghost Convoy. It had been sitting there, in the dark, while the world changed around it. The tires had rotted away. The engine was seized. But the soul of the car was intact. But that was just one. Other stories began to emerge. A 770K Grosser was found in a scrapyard in Russia, being used as a tractor to pull stumps out of the ground. The Soviet farmer had cut off the rear armor plate to weld on a tow hitch. Another was found in the basement of a hotel in Sweden. They had walled it up in 1945 to hide it from thieves, and then forgot it existed. When they demolished the building 50 years later, the wrecking ball hit something that wouldn't break. But the most tragic discovery was the Blue Goose, Hermann Göring's personal Special Roadster, a car of unimaginable beauty. It was found in the backyard of a U.S. Army sergeant in Texas. It had been sitting in the sun for 20 years. The convertible top had rotted away. The leather was destroyed by the rain. Weeds were growing through the floorboards. A family of possums was living in the supercharger. When the restorers finally dragged it out, it looked like a corpse. But these machines are not like other cars. They are made of Krupp steel. They are stubborn. They refuse to die. The collectors looked at the ruin and saw potential. They saw history. And they knew that bringing it back to life would cost more than its weight in gold. The restoration era had begun. The decision to restore a ghost car is not made lightly. It is not a repair job. It is an archaeological excavation. The car is moved to a climate-controlled facility, usually a sterile, white workshop in California, or a hidden garage in the Black Forest of Germany. The disassembly begins. Every bolt, every screw, every washer, they are removed, cataloged, photographed, and placed in labeled bags. A standard car has 5,000 parts. A Mercedes 540K Special Roadster? It has over 15,000 individual components. The engine block is X-rayed for hairline cracks. The chassis is laser scanned to within a fraction of a millimeter to check for warping. But the real nightmare is the missing parts. You cannot walk into a store and buy a fuel pump for a 1937 Nazi prototype. You cannot order a supercharger gasket online. If a part is missing, you have to make it. Master machinists spend months staring at faded blueprints from the Daimler archives. They use lathes and milling machines to carve new pistons out of solid blocks of aluminum. They don't just copy the shape, they copy the flaws. They copy the tool marks of the original 1930s workers to ensure absolute authenticity. Then comes the interior. The leather cannot look new, it has to look correct. Restorers hunt for cows raised in fields with no barbed wire fences, so there are no scars on the hide. They use horsehair for the seat stuffing, just like the factory did. They use nitrocellulose lacquer for the paint, a toxic, difficult chemical that takes 6 months to cure and polish. The cost? Staggering. A full restoration can take 5 years. It can cost $2, maybe $3 million. Families go bankrupt chasing this dream. Marriages fail. It is an obsession that consumes everything. But then, one day, the silence of the workshop is broken. The key is turned. The fuel pumps tick. The starter motor whines. And with a thunderous roar, the beast wakes up. The straight-8 engine settles into a steady idle. The supercharger whistles. The exhaust spits out a cloud of blue smoke. It is alive. The rust is gone. The rot is gone. It stands there, shimmering under the studio lights, more beautiful than the day it left Berlin. It is no longer a wreck. It is no longer a prisoner of war. it is a masterpiece, and it is ready to face its final judge, Pebble Beach. California, August. We are standing on the 18th fairway of the Pebble Beach golf links. The fog is lifting off the Pacific Ocean. This is the Holy Grail, the Concours d'Elegance. Most people come here to see the shiny cars, the ones that have been restored for millions of dollars, the ones that look like jewelry. But walk past them. Walk past the champagne tents. Walk to the far edge of the lawn. Here, you will find the preservation class. These are the cars that were never restored, the cars that were never painted, the survivors. Among them sits a Mercedes-Benz 540K, but it does not shine. It is dull. It is gray. It looks tired. The judges approach it like forensic scientists at a crime scene. They are wearing white gloves. They carry magnifying glasses and ultrasonic paint thickness gauges. They are not looking for perfection. They are looking for history. They examine the leather on the driver's seat. It is cracked like a dry riverbed. It is stained with the sweat of a driver from 1938. One judge leans in. He smells the interior. Horsehair, he whispers, and old gasoline. You cannot fake that smell. It is the scent of time itself. They open the hood. The engine is not polished. It is covered in a thin layer of oil and grime. But look closer. The lead seal on the fuel pump is still intact. The stamp of the inspector from the Berlin factory is still visible. The judge checks the serial number on the engine block. He compares it to a black book he carries in his pocket. Matching numbers, he nods. This means the engine has never been changed. It is the same heart that beat on the Autobahn 80 years ago. It is the same heart that stopped in the salt mine. In this world, dust is more valuable than gold. If you clean this car, if you polish that fender, you destroy $1 million of value in 10 seconds. The owners of these cars are terrified of rain. They are terrified of cleaning cloths. They guard the dirt as if it were diamond dust. Because once you wipe away the history, you can never get it back. This car is a witness. It saw the war. It saw the peace. It saw the darkness of the garage for 50 years. And today, standing here on the green grass of California, it is finally telling its story without saying a word. The sun sets over the Pacific. Inside the auction tent, the atmosphere changes. The tourists leave. The serious players arrive. The air becomes heavy. It smells of expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and old money. Look at the front row. You won't see the buyers. You will only see their representatives. Men in dark Italian suits holding cell phones connected to Geneva, to Tokyo, to Moscow. The actual billionaires are invisible. They are sitting on yachts offshore or watching via private satellite feeds in penthouses halfway across the world. The lights dim. A spotlight hits the rotating stage. The curtains part, And there it is. The Mercedes-Benz 540K Special Roadster. The lost chassis. It rolls onto the stage silently. It is black on black. It looks like a predator entering a clearing. The auctioneer steps up to the podium. He is a British man with a voice like velvet and eyes like a hawk. He knows exactly who is in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he begins softly, "lot number 104, the King of Cars." He doesn't need to hype it. The car speaks for itself. "We shall start the bidding at $5 million. In a normal auction, hands shoot up everywhere. But here, silence. Nobody wants to be the first to show their hand. They are waiting, testing the water. Then, a paddle goes up in the back of the room. $6 million, the auctioneer nods. Immediately, a phone bidder on the left signals. $7 million. The game has begun. $8 million. $9 million. $10 million. At $12 million, the amateurs drop out. Now it is a duel. It is a battle between two phone banks. One represents a tech mogul from Silicon Valley. The other, a royal family from the Middle East. The increments get smaller, but the tension gets higher. $12,500,000. $13 million. The auctioneer slows down. He milks the silence. He looks directly at the phone bidder. "It's against you, sir, at $13 million. Do not lose this opportunity. You will never see this car again." The representative on the phone is whispering frantically. He is asking for permission to go higher. The room is so quiet, you can hear the hum of the air conditioning. 1,000 people are holding their breath. Then, the representative nods. He raises one finger. $14 million. A gasp goes through the crowd. But the other side is not done. The battle is not about the car anymore. It is about ego. It is about dominance. They are fighting for the right to own a ghost. $15 million. $16 million. The numbers have lost their meaning. They are just abstract concepts now. The bidder on the right shakes his head. He puts his phone down. He is out. The room exhales. The auctioneer scans the crowd one last time. He raises the gavel slowly. It hangs in the air like an executioner's axe. "Going once at $16 million. Going twice. Sold!" The applause is polite, but underneath it, there is a sense of loss. The car is wheeled away. It disappears behind the velvet curtains. It is going into another dark vault, maybe for another 50 years. As the lights in the tent go down, we are left with a question. Why? Why do we chase these machines? Why do we dig them out of frozen lakes? Why do we spend lifetimes searching for a rusted chassis number? Maybe it's because they are the only things that survived. The men who built them are gone. The empire that ordered them is dust. The drivers who raced them are memories. But the steel? The steel remembers. It remembers the roar of the Autobahn in 1938. It remembers the cold silence of the salt mine. It remembers the darkness of the water. These cars are not just metal. They are time capsules. They are the iron jewels of a lost world. And as long as there are people willing to hunt for them, as long as there are maps with empty spaces and barns with locked doors, the story is not over. The hunt continues. We thought the story ended with the auction, but history always has a postscript. While the Americans were restoring cars in California, a completely different reality was hiding behind the Iron Curtain. For 50 years, the Soviet Union was a black hole for information. Nobody knew what had happened to the cars taken by the Red Army in 1945. But when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the doors opened. Western car hunters flooded into Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. They were looking for the lost convoy. What they found was shocking. They found the chassis of the legendary 540Ks, but they were not preserved in salt. They were not hidden in lakes. They were working. In the villages of Siberia, inside crumbling barns in Estonia, these royal machines had been turned into beasts of burden. The Soviet mechanics didn't care about originality. They cared about survival. When the complex German superchargers failed, they didn't fix them. They threw them away. In their place, they welded in heavy, vibrating diesel engines from Soviet tractors. Imagine a masterpiece of Art Deco design, vibrating and smoking with a truck engine under the hood. They cut the fenders to fit massive snow tires. They welded steel plates over the convertible roofs to survive the Russian winter. These cars are known as the Frankensteins. To a purist, they are destroyed, but to a historian, they are fascinating. They tell a story of survival against all odds. They show how a machine built for luxury adapted to a life of hardship. One famous example was found being used as a chicken coop in Lithuania. The chickens were nesting on the leather seats. The dashboard was covered in straw. But when they scraped away the dirt on the chassis rail, the number was still there. It was one of the missing Special Roadsters. And now, we face a new problem. These cars have become too valuable to exist. When a machine is worth $20 million, you cannot drive it. You cannot risk a flat tire. You cannot risk a scratch. They have become statues, locked in climate-controlled vaults, hidden from the world. But technology has given them a second life. Enter the age of the digital twin. In secret workshops in Stuttgart and Los Angeles, engineers are doing something incredible. They are not using wrenches. They are using lasers. They scan the original cars with blue light 3D scanners. They map every curve, every bolt, every imperfection down to the micron. They create a ghost of the car inside the computer, a file that will last forever. And then they hit print. Using industrial 3D printers and advanced CNC machines, they are building clones. These are not cheap replicas. These are exact biological twins of the original. The steel is the same alloy. The engine sound is identical. The leather smells the same. The billionaire owners can now leave the $20 million original safely in the vault and drive the clone on the racetrack. They can crash it. They can race it. They can feel the wind in their hair, just like the test drivers did in 1938. So, in the end, the Iron Jewels achieved something that their creators never could: immortality. The Third Reich fell. The Wall fell. The Soviet Union fell. But the car? The car survived. It survived the fire. It survived the water. It survived the silence. And now, stored in binary code and cast in new steel, it will survive us all. The engine will never truly stop. The ghost will drive forever.